When no contact begins, you step away completely. The conversations stop, the check-ins disappear, and silence takes the place of what used to be regular connection. From the outside, it can look like nothing significant is happening, especially with avoidant individuals who often come across as emotionally distant or unaffected. But that surface-level calm can be misleading. Internally, there is usually a lot more activity than they ever show. They may not express it or respond outwardly, but they still notice the absence and the change in dynamics. What looks like indifference is often private emotional processing that never gets spoken about. During this stage, unspoken expectations slowly start forming in the background of their mind, shaping how they interpret your silence and what they assume your next move might be. The first quiet expectation is that you will eventually come back and reach out. This isn't driven by ego, but by experience. In many of their past relationships, emotional distance was usually closed by the other person, so over time they begin to expect the same pattern. They create space and unconsciously wait for someone else to fill it. So when you don't text, don't call, and don't try to reconnect, it disrupts that familiar script. Even if they act like it doesn't matter, your absence is still noticed. It doesn't disappear from their awareness. Instead, it sits in the background, quietly registering day after day. The silence feels meaningful to them, even if they never acknowledge it directly. The second expectation runs deeper emotionally. Part of them assumes that you're still holding a kind of space for them in your life, even if nothing is happening right now. They may not say this openly, but it shapes how they process your silence. It can feel to them like you're simply waiting, giving time, and that eventually you might still be there when they are ready. This creates comfort without requiring emotional risk from them. In their inner world, you are not fully gone, just paused at a distance, still connected in an unspoken way. But underneath that assumption is also a quiet fear of permanent loss. So they end up balancing between believing you're still there and worrying that you might not be anymore. The third layer is more conflicted. Even while pulling away, there is often a hidden hope that you will challenge their expectations and prove them wrong. Many avoidant people carry a belief that they are hard to love or that closeness eventually leads to rejection. So when you step back during no contact, a part of them may wonder if you'll return, pursue them, or show that they still matter enough to you. This is where their testing patterns come from. They push people away, but at the same time they watch to see who stays. And when no one comes after them, it can quietly reinforce their deepest fear that the connection was never truly secure to begin with, creating that inner push and pull. The final expectation is a need for clarity without emotional exposure. During no contact, they often want to understand what happened, what you feel, and what everything meant, but without opening up their own emotional side in the same way. It becomes a one-sided search for answers. They may check your social media, reread old messages, or replay past conversations to make sense of things without directly reaching out. It's a way of trying to reduce uncertainty while still avoiding vulnerability. Even in silence, their attention doesn't fully detach. They analyze, look for signs, and try to build meaning from fragments. But without a real conversation, they're left interpreting pieces instead of facing direct emotional clarity. They're often trying to make sense of everything without ever directly asking the questions out loud. Instead of confronting what went wrong, they prefer to sit with it privately, turning it over in their own mind, quietly and on their own terms. At the same time, there's another subtle expectation forming during no contact. Some avoidant individuals hope that distance will lead to change in you, not in personality, but in emotional independence. They imagine you becoming more grounded, less emotionally demanding, and easier to be around, not because you were too much, but because closeness feels overwhelming to them. In their mind, if reconnection ever happens, it needs to feel calm, safe, and low pressure. So they start to picture silence as something that is reshaping you into someone they can engage with without feeling emotionally flooded or pressured. There's also a strong contradiction in what they want emotionally. They want to feel remembered and missed, but not depended on or emotionally responsible for. They want to matter to you, but without feeling tied down by that importance. So during no contact, they quietly watch for signs that they still have emotional relevance in your life. That sense of being thought about can boost their inner sense of value. But if they sense emotional neediness, it pushes them away again. Alongside this is a deeper fear they rarely show, the fear of being replaced. Even if they act indifferent, their mind can drift into comparisons and what-if scenarios, imagining you with someone who understands you better. That imagined loss can bring regret or discomfort, but instead of expressing it, they tend to withdraw further into silence as a form of self-protection. At times, they may even frame no contact as a form of emotional consequence, believing that distance might make you feel what they once felt. But that mindset doesn't stay fixed. As time passes, it often shifts from defensiveness into something more vulnerable and uncertain. Beneath everything, there is usually a quiet hope that the connection isn't fully over, even if they are not ready to re-enter it. And the most unspoken expectation of all is this: a belief that you will eventually understand them without needing everything spelled out. That you will interpret their distance not as lack of care, but as fear, and somehow still see the emotional truth behind their silence. The idea that someone will carefully try to interpret your silence and still decide to care is a deeply comforting fantasy. It can create a sense of emotional connection even when there is no direct communication happening anymore. In an avoidant mindset, this kind of interpretation keeps a bond alive internally, even after distance or separation has been established. Silence stops feeling like a full ending and starts feeling like something that still carries meaning. It allows them to believe that you are still emotionally tuned into them, even without words. So even in withdrawal, there can be a quiet thread of attachment that continues to exist, not through interaction, but through imagination and the hope that they are still understood on some unspoken level. The real turning point is when you stop organizing your behavior around what someone else might secretly expect from you and start reconnecting with what you actually need. Constantly adjusting yourself to fit unspoken emotional standards slowly pulls you away from your own center. No contact was never meant to be a way to influence someone back into your life. It is meant to bring you back into alignment with your own self-worth. In that silence, something important begins to shift. The need for validation from someone inconsistent starts to weaken, and your focus naturally returns to yourself. Instead of performing for connection, you begin to rebuild clarity, stability, and emotional independence. That is where real recovery begins, not in being chosen, but in no longer depending on being chosen to feel whole. If that person ever does reappear, it won't be because you successfully matched their hidden expectations or stayed locked in the same emotional cycle. It will happen because you changed the dynamic completely. You stopped chasing and started standing in calm certainty. That kind of grounded energy can feel unfamiliar to someone used to push and pull patterns because there is nothing left to chase or control. Your silence is no longer emotional absence. It becomes a reflection of growth and self-respect. And whether they return or not, you are no longer operating from the same emotional place you once were. What matters most is that your peace is no longer negotiable, and your life is no longer paused around someone else's inability to stay consistent. What usually gets overlooked in no contact is that both sides are often dealing with uncertainty, just in very different ways. The avoidant side tends to manage uncertainty by distancing themselves from emotional intensity, while the other side often tries to resolve uncertainty through understanding, closure, or reconnection. That mismatch creates a cycle where one person pulls back to feel safe and the other reaches out to feel secure. When contact stops completely, that cycle doesn't just disappear, it gets replaced by internal storytelling on both sides. Each person starts filling in the gaps with assumptions, memories, and imagined meanings because there is no longer a shared reality being updated through communication. Over time, silence begins to shape perception more than actual events. The mind doesn't handle emptiness well, so it creates narratives to make things feel more understandable. For someone with avoidant tendencies, that can mean idealizing distance as safety or convincing themselves that emotional intensity was the real problem. For the other person, it can mean turning silence into proof of meaning, importance, or unfinished connection. Neither narrative is fully accurate, but both feel real in the absence of clarity. That's why no contact often becomes less about the relationship itself and more about what each person projects onto the silence. One of the deeper shifts that can happen during this period is the realization that closure doesn't always come from understanding the other person. Sometimes it comes from seeing the pattern clearly enough that you no longer need every unanswered question resolved. You start to notice how much energy was going into interpreting signals, managing emotional unpredictability, or trying to create stability from inconsistency. And slowly, the focus moves away from decoding someone else and toward rebuilding your own emotional baseline. At that point, the dynamic changes internally, even if nothing changes externally. The emotional pull weakens not because feelings disappear overnight, but because your attention is no longer organized around waiting or interpreting. You stop living in reaction to absence and start returning to your own rhythm. That is usually where the real detachment happens, not through force or suppression, but through redirection of focus. And once that shift begins, the connection no longer has the same control over your emotional state, regardless of whether the other person ever returns or not. Another important layer in all of this is how attachment patterns don't just influence how someone behaves in relationships, but also how they interpret time, distance, and emotional pauses. In no contact, time feels very different for each side. For someone leaning avoidant, distance can initially feel like relief because it reduces emotional pressure and removes the need for immediate responses or emotional engagement. But that relief is not the same as resolution. As time passes, the absence of interaction can start to feel less like freedom and more like uncertainty that hasn't been processed. The nervous system may appear calm on the outside, but internally it is still registering change, especially when a connection once had emotional weight. On the other side, the absence often feels more direct and emotionally charged because there is no buffer or emotional distancing mechanism in the same way. So the mind stays engaged longer, trying to make sense of what is unresolved. This difference in processing speed is one of the main reasons misunderstandings grow after separation. One person appears to move on quickly, while the other is still emotionally engaged, and that creates the illusion that one side cared less, even when the reality is more complex and less linear. What also tends to happen in silence is a shift from emotional memory to selective memory. The brain starts highlighting certain moments while downplaying others, especially moments that support whatever emotional state the person is currently in. If someone feels safe in distance, they may remember the relationship as more overwhelming than it actually was. If someone feels loss, they may remember only the best parts and minimize the difficulties. Neither version is fully accurate, but both become emotionally convincing because they are reinforced internally without external correction. This is why no contact can feel so psychologically intense, even when nothing is happening on the surface. The real activity is internal, not external. Thoughts loop, interpretations shift, and meaning keeps evolving in private. Without conversation to ground reality, perception becomes fluid, shaped more by emotion than by facts. That's also where people often start confusing longing with compatibility, or peace with emotional suppression, because silence removes the feedback that normally keeps those distinctions clear. Eventually, the most stabilizing shift is when you stop treating silence as something you need to decode and start seeing it as information about patterns rather than proof of meaning. Not every silence carries a hidden message. Not every absence requires interpretation. Some of it is simply distance doing what distance does. And when that realization settles in, the emotional grip loosens, not because the connection is fully erased, but because you are no longer trying to solve it through imagination. In the end, what no contact really exposes is not just the other person's emotional style, but your own relationship with uncertainty. It shows how much energy you were putting into trying to interpret, stabilize, or mentally complete something that was never fully consistent to begin with. When someone is inconsistent or emotionally distant, the mind naturally tries to fill the gaps because ambiguity feels uncomfortable. So you start creating meaning out of silence, reading depth into distance, and hoping that absence still carries connection. But over time, that pattern becomes exhausting because you are essentially maintaining the relationship alone in your thoughts while having no real exchange in reality. The deeper shift happens when you realize that clarity doesn't always come from understanding the other person better. Sometimes it comes from accepting that the pattern itself is the answer. You don't need every message, reaction, or explanation to fully make sense of what happened. At a certain point, the emotional weight you carry is not about the current situation anymore, but about how long you stayed in something that required so much decoding just to feel secure. That realization can be uncomfortable, but it is also freeing because it brings you back to what you can actually control: your attention, your boundaries, and your emotional direction. No contact then stops being a waiting period and starts becoming a reset point. Not a tactic to influence someone else, but a space where your nervous system finally stops reacting to unpredictability. The absence of contact begins to lose its emotional charge because you are no longer assigning it meaning every day. Instead of checking for signs, revisiting old conversations, or imagining outcomes, your focus slowly shifts back to your own life in a more grounded way. That doesn't mean feelings disappear instantly. It means they stop leading your decisions. And if there is any real takeaway from this dynamic, it is that peace cannot be built inside confusion. You cannot stabilize yourself inside a cycle that depends on inconsistency to exist. At some point, emotional maturity becomes less about understanding the other person and more about choosing what kind of emotional environment you are willing to stay in, because love, attention, or potential is never enough if it constantly pulls you away from your own center. What you build next should not require you to overthink your worth, decode silence, or shrink your needs just to maintain connection. So the real ending of no contact is not about whether someone returns or not. It is about whether you return to yourself. And once that happens, the silence is no longer something you fear or interpret. It simply becomes space. Space to rebuild, space to breathe, and space to finally experience relationships where clarity is not something you have to fight for, but something that is naturally present.